Greetings, folks. Welcome. A fundamental concept in economics is that the amount of capital available per worker impacts their productivity, where productivity is a measure of the goods and services made per person. This is the case for physical capital and things such as equipment and machinery. You and I are a prime example of the effects of capital on productivity. To make this video, I'm using capital such as my computer and a few types of software, and we're using digital infrastructure for you to watch the video online. Because of this capital, I am able to expand the reach of my work and increase my productivity. The positive effect of capital on productivity also applies to human capital, such as a person's skills, experience, knowledge, and education. In fact, many people would argue that human capital is more important than physical capital in affecting a region's productivity and economic development. To appreciate the importance of human capital to state and regional economic development, all you need to do is look at the changes happening in the overall U.S. economy. U.S. manufacturing employment declined by 40% between 1990 and 2014, and manufacturing employment was considerably lower in 1990 than decades before. Over the same period of 1990 to 2014, engineering services increased by 57%, and employment in hospitals grew by 34%. When we look at the industries that were growing versus declining, we see that many of the fastest growing sectors have a greater emphasis on knowledge and information, as well as higher requirements for education and things like licenses and certifications. To define human capital, we'll describe it as the education, skills, experience, and know-how used by workers in the production of goods and services. And although we're going to look at a lot of research and analysis about the impacts of human capital on economic development, Edward Glaeser pretty much sums it up in the book Triumph of the City. Glaeser notes that human capital, far more than physical infrastructure, explains which cities succeed. In my work, I define economic development as the growth of good jobs in a region to improve the well-being of people in the places where they reside. If we use earnings as an indicator of well-being, it's pretty clear that education helps a person's own well-being. Here's a table that shows weekly earnings data in 2016 from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Workers with less than a high school diploma had a median weekly earnings of about $500, and median weekly earnings are more than double at over $1,100 for workers with a bachelor's degree. For people with a professional degree, median weekly earnings were over $1,700 in 2016. Also, education helps people move up the job ladder into better jobs. In a study with Jason Abel and Richard Florida, we used 4 characteristics of occupations to identify good jobs: hourly pay, the number of hours worked per week, with closer to 40 hours as the standard for a good job, whether or not a worker gets health insurance, and the job's level of prestige. More specifically, we used actual data on hundreds of U.S. occupations to build a job quality index. Again, this index is based on hourly wages, number of hours worked per week, health insurance, and prestige. And then we used the index to categorize jobs by job quality quartile. So you have occupations in the first quartile. This is the lowest ranking job to the 25th percentile. The second quartile, this is the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile, which is the median. The third quartile, this is the median to the 75th percentile. And then the top quartile of jobs, this is the 75th percentile to the best ranking job, or the 100th percentile. In our analysis, we were particularly interested in what happens to people with jobs in the first quartile of occupations. That is, are people able to transition from these low-quality jobs into occupations in higher quartiles? What we learned is that it's very difficult to move from a job in the first quartile to a better job. In fact, of the workers who started in a job in the first quartile of our job quality index, only about 5% transitioned into a better job. The most common outcome, and this represents 72% of the people we studied, is to stay in the same occupation. Also of note, 7% of the people in the first quartile of occupations became unemployed. So it was actually more common to lose a job than to transition into a better job. But if you're looking for a key to moving into a better job, our research found that education is a very important factor. Here's a figure that shows the effects of having a 4-year college degree on what happens to people in occupations that are in the bottom quartile of jobs according to our job quality index. These impacts are measured compared to someone without a high school diploma, and the bar heights represent the magnitudes of the effects. The most important thing to notice is that having a college degree makes a person considerably more likely to transition from a job in the bottom quartile of occupations into a better job. Also, compared to someone without a high school diploma, having a college degree lowers the likelihood of exiting the labor force or becoming unemployed. So I think the evidence is pretty clear that human capital helps the economic well-being of people, but it also helps the well-being of the places where they reside. Research shows that human capital helps cities reinvent themselves, and it generates spillovers that enhance the productivity of others. These spillovers are often referred to as human capital externalities, which are similar to externalities that come up elsewhere in economics. The standard definition of externality is when one person's actions affect the well-being of others, and there's no compensation for the impact. In the case of a positive externality, this comes from something like getting a flu shot. The person's action has a positive effect on others. And because the person getting a flu shot is not handed a $5 bill from everyone they walk past, it's not compensated. In the case of a negative externality, this comes from something like air pollution from driving a car. The person's actions have a negative effect on others. And because the person driving the car doesn't hand out a $5 bill to everyone affected by the air pollution, it's not compensated. In the case of a human capital externality, the action happens when a person acquires more skills, knowledge, or education. And along with increasing a person's own productivity and earnings, having more human capital has been found to increase the productivity of others. But since the person who increased their human capital is not handed a $5 bill from people around them, it's uncompensated. Just like people are not compensated for the positive impact on others from getting a flu shot. With all this as a backdrop, let's look at the relationship between the economic development of U.S. regions and human capital. We'll start by measuring human capital in terms of college attainment, but we'll look at other indicators of human capital later. The scatter plot has the Economic Development Index of metropolitan areas on the up and down axis, or the y-axis. The Economic Development Index is a combination of an employment growth index, an income index, and a third index that represents the persistence of employment, that is, the ups and downs of employment over time. As such, the Economic Development Index is a measure of the growth of good jobs in a region. On the x-axis, or side to side, we measure the percentage of the workforce with at least a 4-year college degree as of 1990. I use the year 1990 to measure the human capital of regions because the economic development indices capture conditions between 1990 and the mid-2000 teens. So the idea is to see if conditions way back in 1990 affected the performance of regions moving into the future. The scatter plot has an upward sloping trend line, and I show it as a solid line because the relationship between the economic development of U.S. metros and college attainment is statistically significant. In other words, the analysis shows that human capital back in 1990 helped the growth of good jobs moving forward. The scatter plot includes all U.S. metropolitan areas, and there's about 380 in our sample, but it's also interesting to look at how college attainment affects different sized regions. In this figure, we summarize the relationship between the Economic Development Index and college attainment for states, all metropolitan areas, that's what we just looked at in the scatter plot, and then subsets of large metros with 1 million or more people and small metros. The height of the bar in the figure represents the size of the change in a region's economic development index in terms of standard deviations relative to a 1 standard deviation increase in a region's college attainment percentage. The second bar, labeled as all metros, summarizes the scatter plot that we just looked at. The height of the bar tells us that a 1 standard deviation in a metropolitan area's percentage of the workforce with at least a 4-year college degree corresponds with about a 0.25 standard deviation increase in the Economic Development Index. The bar is shaded to indicate a statistically significant effect. The first bar, labeled as states, tells us that differences in the college attainment shares across states do not have an effect, one way or another, on the Economic Development Index of states. When focusing on the size of metros, we see that human capital is particularly important to the economic development of metros with 1 million or more people. A 1 standard deviation increase in a large metro's percentage of the workforce with at least a 4-year college degree corresponds with about a 0.45 standard deviation increase in the Economic Development Index when focusing only on large metros. The effect is much smaller in metros with fewer than 1 million residents. It's also interesting to look at the ways in which human capital affects the economic development of large metros. In this figure, we look at the effects of human capital in large metros on the employment index, income index, persistence index, and of course the overall economic development index. The bar labeled as Economic Development Index, which has a height of around 0.45, was shown in the previous figure. The new information shown in this figure tells us that, whereas the college attainment of large metros does not have a statistically significant effect on the employment index, that is, the bar is not shaded, this indicator of human capital has a very large impact on the income index, which is a measure of the productivity of regions. In fact, a 1 standard deviation increase in a large metro's percentage of the workforce with at least a 4-year college degree corresponds with about a 0.65 standard deviation increase in the income index when focusing only on large metros. College attainment has a statistically significant effect on the persistence index of large metros, too. So we found that human capital, in terms of the college attainment of people in a region, has a positive effect on the economic development of metropolitan areas, but it's especially important for large metros. This result is consistent with research that looks at how human capital interacts with population size, or in some studies population density, to increase the productivity of regions. Although other researchers have studied this topic too, a project that I conducted with Jason Abel and Ishida Day examined the relationship between the productivity of U.S. metropolitan areas and the density of human capital. In a nutshell, we looked at how the effects of human capital on productivity was influenced by the population density of a metro. And as it turned out, the effect of human capital on productivity is larger in places with higher levels of population density, which is similar to our earlier result that human capital is especially important to the economic development of the biggest cities. A reason behind this result is that human capital spillovers, which is an explanation we talked about for how human capital affects regions, are likely to be more impactful in places of higher density. Another key finding related to how human capital impacts regions is that it affects the quality of jobs as represented by the income and persistence indices more so than employment growth. We've covered a lot of ground about human capital, so let's end here. And hopefully this video has increased your human capital in the area of economic development. As for key takeaways, we learned that human capital is important to individuals, both in terms of high wages, but also in terms of job quality. Our analysis also showed that human capital, as measured by college attainment, is important to regions in terms of the quality of jobs, but not necessarily the growth of regions. Finally, the results show that human capital has especially large impacts on good jobs in the biggest metropolitan areas. This is partly due to human capital spillovers, or externalities, if you want to use fancy talk, in densely settled areas.